Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Arizona Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The sound of creaking wood under pressure was the first thing that struck visitors to the Ortega Ranch. It was a sound that persisted even when no one was walking on the floorboards. Located 23 miles southeast of Prescott, in what was then Arizona Territory, the Ortega Ranch sat in a valley nestled between the Bradshaw Mountains and the Mingus Mountain Range. In the autumn of 1893, local authorities were called to investigate the disappearance of ranch owner Santiago Ortega. What they discovered would remain unspoken in the region for decades. Sheriff Thomas Buchanan arrived at the property on October 12th. According to his preserved field notes, he found the main house unlocked but eerily intact. No signs of struggle, no indication of robbery. The only unusual element was a persistent smell coming from the well behind the house. A smell unlike anything I've encountered in my 26 years as a lawman, he wrote. The property's 8 wells had been the source of the Ortega family's modest wealth. In a land where water determined survival, Santiago Ortega had arrived from Sonora in 1877 and seemingly struck liquid gold. Buchanan's notes describe the interior of the main house with unusual detail for a routine missing persons report. The parlor contains furnishings of notable quality, inconsistent with the typical frontier residence: a piano of European manufacture, tapestries that appear to be of Spanish origin, books in multiple languages, the residence of an educated man of means, not a simple cattle rancher. This observation raises an intriguing question. How had Santiago Ortega, who arrived in Arizona Territory with reportedly limited resources, acquired such wealth in less than 2 decades? What made the disappearance particularly unusual was the meticulous condition of the house. The table was set for dinner for 5 people, though Santiago lived alone. His clothes were neatly folded in drawers. His ledgers showed no unusual transactions. His horses remained in their stable, well fed. It was as if he had stepped away momentarily and intended to return. The initial report filed by Sheriff Buchanan concluded, likely the victim of bandits while inspecting his property. The case was effectively closed before it began. But something wasn't right at the Ortega Ranch. According to records from the county clerk's office, Santiago had purchased approximately 400 acres of seemingly worthless land in 1877 for a price well above market value. The seller was a mining company that had failed to find any precious metals in the area. The only notable feature of the land were natural springs that formed seasonal ponds, hardly enough to justify the price. Within 3 years, the Ortega Ranch had become one of the most productive cattle operations in the territory, supported by a network of 8 deep wells that never ran dry, even during the drought of 1888. The earliest documented observation of the unusual properties of the Ortega wells comes from a territorial tax assessor named Jeremiah Collins. In his 1882 assessment report, Collins noted, "Property includes 8 water wells of exceptional quality. Each well appears identical in construction and depth. Water level in each measured at precisely 12 feet from surface. Water clarity exceeds that of any natural source in the region." Collins also recorded something that later assessors would omit. Proprietor Ortega maintains curious practice of naming each well, not by numbers or location, but by personal names. When questioned about this practice, Ortega stated that the waters remember who they were. Collins dismissed this as a cultural superstition and did not include it in his final assessment. Neighbors described Santiago as an intensely private man who rarely ventured into town. He employed 4 ranch hands who lived in a bunkhouse near the main house. All 4 disappeared the same night as Santiago. Their names were recorded as Mateo Vasquez, Felipe Mendoza, Carlos Fuentes, and a man known only as Rodriguez. Like Santiago, They were originally from Sonora. Unlike Santiago, they had no recorded history before arriving at the ranch. It was as if they appeared from nowhere specifically to work at the Ortega ranch. No photographs of any of them have been found. An overlooked detail in Sheriff Buchanan's investigation concerns the personal effects found in the bunkhouse. Each ranch hand maintained minimal possessions, but each had identical brass pendants among their belongings. The pendants featured unusual engravings, concentric circles surrounding what appeared to be a stylized well or deep hole. Buchanan noted this curiosity, but attributed no significance to it. The pendants were logged into evidence and eventually disappeared from the county's records. The story of the Ortega Ranch might have ended there. Another mysterious disappearance in the still wild Western Territories. But 8 months after Santiago's disappearance, a land surveyor named William Edwards made a discovery that challenged everything known about the property. Edwards had been commissioned to survey the region for potential railroad expansion. His field notes, preserved in the territorial archives, describe a finding that caused him to immediately abandon the project. I approached what appeared to be the main well of the Ortega property with the intention of replenishing my water supply, wrote Edwards. Upon drawing the bucket upward, I discovered what appeared to be a section of leather-bound journal floating on the surface. The pages were mostly illegible due to water damage, but several fragments remained readable. The text was in Spanish, which I am somewhat familiar with. One passage read, "The water speaks at night, always from the easternmost well, always at midnight, always in my mother's voice." Edwards' field notes continue with observations that suggest his professional demeanor was shaken by the discovery. The water in the bucket exhibited unusual behavior. Despite the absence of wind, the surface trembled continuously, as if disturbed from below. When I set the bucket down to examine the journal fragment, the water became still instantly. Upon retrieving the bucket again, I observed that the water level had decreased by approximately 1 inch, though no leak was apparent. I experienced an inexplicable reluctance to touch the water thereafter. Edwards reported his finding to Sheriff Buchanan, who dismissed it as irrelevant. The surveyor, however, was disturbed enough to request reassignment to a different region. His request was granted. No other surveyor would examine the Ortega property for another 17 years. Edwards never returned to Arizona Territory. Records indicate he relocated to Oregon, where he abandoned surveying entirely and became a bookseller. Following Santiago's disappearance, the property remained in legal limbo. He had no known relatives, and the territorial government was reluctant to claim the land due to questions about original ownership. The mining company that had sold Santiago the land had dissolved, its principals scattered across different states and territories. The ranch house remained empty, occasionally used as shelter by travelers, but never occupied for long. Local ranchers reported that cattle avoided the area, even during drought, when the wells represented the only water source for miles. One such traveler, a prospector named Howard Jenkins, spent 3 nights at the abandoned ranch house in 1896. Jenkins later recounted his experience to a journalist from the Prescott Weekly Journal-Miner. The newspaper never published his account, deeming it the rambling of an unstable mind, but the reporter's notes survived in the newspaper's archives. Jenkins claimed that during each night of his stay, he was awakened by the sound of water running through the house's long, disconnected pipes. It sounded like a rush of water through every wall, every floorboard, he reportedly said. But when I lit my lantern to investigate, the sound ceased immediately. On the 3rd night, I heard voices speaking in Spanish coming from the kitchen. When I entered, the room was empty, but a puddle of water lay on the floor beneath the table. 5 distinct puddles, arranged as if marking where 5 pairs of feet had stood. Jenkins departed the following morning and reportedly never again spent a night under any roof, preferring to sleep under the open sky regardless of weather. In 1900, 7 years after Santiago's disappearance, the territorial government finally took possession of the property. An inventory conducted by county officials documented the curious state of the ranch house. Despite years of abandonment, it appeared remarkably preserved. Dust had settled on surfaces, but there was no evidence of animal intrusion or weather damage. The dinner table remained set with 5-place settings, the chairs arranged as if awaiting guests. In the master bedroom, officials found Santiago's clothing still hanging in the wardrobe, his boots placed neatly at the foot of a perfectly made bed. The inventory team consisted of 3 officials, County Assessor Frederick Marsh, Deputy Sheriff Calvin Ward, and Clerk Robert Thompson. Their report was methodical and dispassionate, as befitting a legal document. However, Marsh kept a personal journal discovered among his effects after his death in 1921. His journal entry regarding the Ortega inventory reveals details omitted from the official report. The house maintains an unnatural coolness despite the June heat. He wrote, "The air feels dense, as if heavy with moisture, yet no dampness is visible on any surface." Thompson remarked that it felt like standing at the bottom of a dry well. Ward refused to separate from us during the entire inventory process, insisting we move through the house as a group. When questioned privately about this behavior, he stated only that, "This house doesn't want us here." Although I find myself eager to complete our task and depart before nightfall. Unnos. The inventory mentioned another oddity. Each of the 8 wells on the property had been covered with heavy wooden lids, secured with padlocks. The keys were found hanging in Santiago's office, labeled in Spanish with numbers 1 through 8. When officials unlocked the covers, they found each well was lined with brick to a depth of approximately 20 feet, after which they appeared to connect to natural underground channels. The water level in all 8 wells was identical, exactly 12 feet from the surface. The water was clear and cold. Tests revealed no contamination, yet no one would drink from those wells. The officials brought their own water supplies for the 3 days it took to complete the inventory. Their report does not explain this decision. Marsh's journal provides context. Ward insisted we document the wells, though I questioned the necessity of inspecting each one. They appear identical in construction. Ward was particularly interested in the precise distance to the water surface in each well. He measured each personally and appeared disturbed to find the same measurement in all 8, exactly 12 feet. He then performed a curious test. He dropped a marked stone into the central well and watched it sink. He then hurried to the westernmost well and peered inside with his lantern. He refused to explain this action, but I observed him make a notation in his personal notebook. They are connected, but not to each other. Punst. When I inquired about drinking from the wells to replenish our supplies, both Ward and Thompson reacted with unusual vehemence against the idea. We continued to ration our brought water despite growing discomfort in the heat. The first attempt to reestablish the Ortega Ranch as a working cattle operation came in 1905. A businessman from Phoenix named Theodore Lambert purchased the property from the territorial government for a fraction of its potential value. Lambert was a pragmatist who dismissed local superstitions. "Water is water," he reportedly said when warned about the wells, "and profitable land is profitable land." Lambert's background suggests he should have been ideally suited to redevelop the property. He had successfully established 3 other ranches in Arizona Territory and had a reputation for turning marginal land into productive operations. His correspondence with potential investors, preserved in the archives of a Phoenix bank, reveals his initial optimism about the Ortega property. "The land has been neglected, but not damaged. The wells alone justify the purchase price. I have tested the water personally and found it exceptional, clear, cold, and with mineral properties that I believe will prove beneficial to livestock. I anticipate recovering my investment within 18 months. Lambert hired a crew of 10 workers to rehabilitate the property. He chose men from outside the region who would not be influenced by local rumors. Work progressed rapidly. The main house was renovated, fences were repaired. By spring of 1906, Lambert had introduced a herd of 150 cattle to the land. The daily operation logs kept by Lambert's foreman, James Sullivan, show normal ranch activities through March 1906. The entries are methodical, recording weather conditions, cattle health, and work completed each day. On March 20th, the tone of the entries changes subtly. Sullivan began recording the behavior of the cattle near the wells. Herd continues to resist approaching central well despite water trough placed nearby. Recommend relocating trough to southeast corner of main pasture. 3 days later, cattle again avoiding central well area. No obvious explanation. Grass is abundant. Shade is available. 2 ranch hands report unusual sounds from well at night. Likely wind through brick shaft. On April 1st, Sullivan's log contains a curious entry. Investigated reports of voices at night, midnight to 3 a.m. at central well. No evidence of trespassers. Sound appears to originate from well itself. Possible echo effect from nearby hills or unusual wind patterns through brick shaft. Instructed hands to ignore and focus on work. This is the last substantee entry. The final notation, dated April 2nd, reads only, water level dropped in all wells simultaneously at sunset. Measured reduction of exactly 4 feet in each. Will consult TL in morning. Territorial records show that on April 3, 1906, Theodore Lambert filed a request with the sheriff's office in Prescott. He reported that his foreman, James Sullivan, had disappeared without explanation. Sullivan's personal belongings remained in his quarters. His horse remained in the stable. His wages, recently paid, were found in his bedside drawer. The sheriff's office filed the report but took no action. Frontier life was unpredictable, and men sometimes left without warning. What the official report doesn't mention is that Lambert personally led a search of the property. A letter to his wife, dated April 4th and never mailed, was found in his desk after his own departure. In it he writes, "We searched every building, every pasture, every ravine. Sullivan is not the type to wander off. He has been with me for 7 years and 3 ranches. The men found his hat near the central well. The well cover was unlocked and moved slightly aside. I lowered Mason on a rope to check the water. He reported the water level at 16 feet below the rim, 4 feet lower than when we arrived last year. He saw nothing unusual in the water, but refused to touch it. When raised, he was shaking visibly and requested reassignment away from the wells. I have granted his request." 3 weeks later, Lambert filed another report. 3 more workers had disappeared. Again, their belongings remained behind. Again, no investigation was conducted. Before the end of May, all 10 of Lambert's employees had vanished. Lambert himself returned to Phoenix, abandoning his investment entirely. The property once again fell into disuse. A curious document exists in the Territorial Archives, a sworn statement given by Lambert to a notary public in Phoenix on June 12, 1906. In it, Lambert attests, "I make this statement of my own free will, and in sound mind. I will never return to the Ortega property. I will never speak of what I observed there. I caution all authorities against allowing settlement of that land. Some places are not meant for human habitation." The notary who recorded this statement, Albert Collins, later wrote to a colleague expressing concern about Lambert's condition when making the declaration. He appeared physically healthy but extremely agitated. His hands trembled throughout our meeting. When I inquired about the specific observations that led to his statement, he refused to elaborate, saying only, "They're still there, all of them, in the water." He insisted on having the statement notarized immediately and made me promise to file it with territorial authorities the same day. In 22 years as a notary, I have never seen a man so determined to create a legal record of his intent never to visit a particular piece of land. Lambert's statement might be dismissed as the reaction of a failed businessman seeking to salvage his reputation, but his subsequent actions are harder to explain. He never again invested in rural property. He liquidated his other holdings outside Phoenix. Most tellingly, county records show he paid for the installation of city water service to his Phoenix home, despite having a functioning well on the property. Lambert died in 1921 without ever publicly explaining his experiences at the Ortega Ranch. A probate inventory of Lambert's estate revealed that he had maintained a locked trunk containing items from the Ortega Ranch. The trunk held Sullivan's journal, several soil samples from the property, and 5 sealed glass bottles containing water from the wells. Each bottle was labeled with a date and well number. A note accompanying the bottles read, "Do not open, do not dispose in household drains. Contents to be buried with me." The executor of Lambert's estate, his nephew William Lambert, disregarded this instruction and emptied the bottles into his garden. William reportedly became obsessed with the garden thereafter, spending hours staring at the soil where the water had been poured. He was eventually committed to an asylum where attendants noted his persistent delusion that voices were speaking to him from beneath the ground. The property remained abandoned until 1912, when Arizona achieved statehood. New surveys were conducted of all territorial lands transitioning to state ownership. The survey team assigned to the former Ortega Ranch consisted of 4 men: Chief Surveyor Robert Caldwell and assistants Peter Mathers, John DeWitt, and Samuel Holloway. They arrived at the property on June 2nd with provisions for a week's work. The team's initial reports, transmitted by courier to Prescott, described routine survey activities. Caldwell's first dispatch noted the excellent condition of the ranch house, despite years of abandonment and the unusual clarity of water in all 8 wells. His second dispatch, sent on June 5th, mentioned that the team had begun detailed mapping of the well system. Wells appear to maintain consistent water levels despite lack of obvious connection to each other. Hydrological principles suggest this should be impossible given the varying elevations of well sites. Further investigation required. No additional dispatches were received. On June 10th, when the team failed to report in, a search party was dispatched from Prescott. They found the surveyor's camp in disarray. Equipment was scattered. Half-eaten food remained on plates. The team's horses were still tethered, though clearly hungry and distressed. Of the 4 men, only Samuel Holloway was found, disoriented and severely dehydrated, wandering near the easternmost well. According to the search party's report, Holloway was in a state of extreme agitation. He could not or would not explain what had happened to his companions. The only coherent statement recorded from him was, "They went down. One by one. They heard their names called from below, and they went down." Holloway was transported to the hospital in Prescott, where he was diagnosed with heat stroke and possible psychological break. He was transferred to the Territorial Asylum in Phoenix 3 days later. A member of the search party, Deputy Marshal Elijah Carter, kept unofficial notes of the search that provide details omitted from the official report. Holloway was found approximately 200 yards from the easternmost well, moving away from the property. His clothing was completely dry, contradicting his claim of having been in one of the wells. His instruments and personal effects were found neatly arranged beside the easternmost well, including his canteen, which was full of water. Testing of this water revealed it to be chemically identical to the well water. Holloway had no explanation for how his canteen came to be filled with water he refused to drink. Carter's notes continue. Search of the central well revealed a rope ladder extending to the water surface. The ladder appeared to be newly constructed from materials found in the ranch house. No sign of the other surveyors was visible in the well. Water level measured at 16 feet below rim, 4 feet lower than noted in Caldwell's dispatch 3 days earlier. While examining the well, I distinctly heard what sounded like distant voices speaking in both English and Spanish from below the water surface. The sound ceased when I lowered a lantern toward the water. I ordered the search discontinued as nightfall approached. Team members expressed unanimous agreement with this decision, without my having to explain my concerns. Hospital records indicate that Holloway refused to drink water during his stay. He became violent when attendants attempted to bathe him. The admitting physician noted, "Patient exhibits extreme hydrophobia inconsistent with desert survival instincts." Holloway died in the asylum 5 weeks after admission. The cause was listed as dehydration, resulting from self-imposed fluid restriction. The fate of the other 3 surveyors was never determined. An attendant at the asylum, Maria Gonzalez, later reported that in his final days, Holloway became calm enough to speak coherently about his experience. According to Gonzalez's statement, preserved in the asylum's employee records, Holloway claimed that the survey team had discovered unusual properties in the well water. Caldwell became obsessed with the consistent water levels, Holloway reportedly said. He developed a theory that the wells connected to a single underground source. On our 5th night, Caldwell thought he heard his name called from the central well. He investigated alone. When he didn't return by morning, DeWitt and Mathers went to search for him. I remained at camp as instructed. Hours later, I heard what sounded like Mathers calling for help from the direction of the wells. When I arrived, I found no one. The easternmost well was uncovered. I heard Mathers' voice coming from inside, calling my name. When I looked down, I saw not water, but what appeared to be the interior of a house. The ranch house, but furnished differently, occupied by 5 men seated at a table. One looked up at me and beckoned. I backed away and ran. I never saw any of my companions again. Gonzalez reported this statement to her superiors, who dismissed it as the raving of a man in the grip of terminal delirium. No official investigation into Holloway's claims was conducted. Gonzalez requested transfer to another ward the following day and refused to discuss Holloway further. Following the Holloway incident, the newly formed Arizona state government designated the former Ortega property as restricted land. No reason was given for this designation. The property was fenced off, and warning signs were posted against trespassing. Local law enforcement was instructed to patrol the area regularly. This unusual level of security for seemingly worthless rangeland persisted for more than a decade. The decision to restrict access was made in a closed session of the Arizona State Land Commission. The minutes of this meeting remain sealed, but a personal letter from Commission Chairman Harold Wilson to Governor George W.P. Hunt provides some insight. Wilson wrote, "The unanimous decision to restrict access to the Ortega property was based on compelling evidence presented by Sheriff Davis of Yavapai County. The sheriff reported multiple disappearances associated with the property dating back to the original owner in 1893. Of particular concern are the unusual properties of the wells, which appear to defy natural law. The Commission recommends permanent restriction of this land to prevent further tragedy. I have authorized the immediate installation of fencing and warning signs with regular patrols to ensure compliance." In 1924, as part of a review of state land management, a committee was formed to assess the status of the Ortega property. The committee's report, now preserved in the state archives, recommended maintaining the restricted designation. The report cited persistent hydrological anomalies without elaboration. A minority opinion filed by committee member Senator James Morrison argued for reopening the land for development. Morrison visited the property personally as part of his assessment. Morrison's initial report to the committee was optimistic about the property's potential. "The land remains fertile despite years of disuse," he wrote. "The ranch house, though in need of repair, is structurally sound. Most significantly, the 8 wells continue to provide clear, cold water in a region where such resources are invaluable. Modern scientific understanding allows us to dismiss the superstitions that have kept this valuable state asset isolated from productive use." In a separate document filed with the committee records, Morrison described his visit. "I examined each of the 8 wells, which remain remarkably preserved despite years of abandonment. Water levels remain consistent in all 8, approximately 12 feet from the surface. Water appears clear and potable. I collected samples from each well for analysis." Morrison's sample analysis was never filed. 3 weeks after his visit to the property, Morrison resigned from the state Senate and relocated to California. No explanation was given for his sudden departure. Morrison's personal correspondence, donated to the Arizona Historical Society by his daughter in 1972, provides a different perspective on his experience at the Ortega Ranch. In a letter to his brother dated 1 week after his visit, Morrison wrote, "I have encountered something I cannot explain. The water samples I collected have changed since I removed them from the property. Each bottle now contains what appears to be a miniature landscape, a perfect replica of the Ortega property, visible when viewing the bottle from above. When I hold the bottles to my ear, I can hear faint voices speaking in Spanish. I dare not open the bottles now. I have sealed them in a wooden box and will dispose of them far from any water source. I am arranging to leave Arizona as soon as my affairs are in order. I advise you never to speak my name near any body of water in this state." The Ortega property remained under state control, but seemingly forgotten by all but a few government officials with access to restricted records. Local residents avoided the area. Maps of the region from this period show a curious blank space where the ranch should be. In some cases, the area is simply marked "State Land, No Access." The fences and warning signs gradually deteriorated, but few ventured onto the property regardless. A folklore researcher from the University of Arizona, Dr. Elena Vasquez, documented local attitudes toward the property in 1937 as part of a study on regional superstitions. Her field notes record interviews with residents of nearby communities who consistently expressed reluctance to discuss the Ortega Ranch. Most respondents claim ignorance of the property despite geographic proximity, Vasquez wrote. When pressed, they acknowledge awareness but refuse detailed discussion. Common phrases include bad water, thirsty land, and the place that calls. Several respondents made warning gestures when the property was mentioned. One elderly woman of Yavapai descent stated, "That place was wrong before the Spanish came. It drinks more than water." Dr. Vasquez attempted to visit the property but reported being overcome by an inexplicable sense of dread as she approached the boundary. She abandoned her inquiry shortly thereafter, noting in her final report that some local beliefs may represent cultural responses to natural phenomena not yet understood by science. Her academic focus shifted to less controversial subjects, and she never revisited the Ortega case in her published work. In 1943, during the resource surveys of World War II, the federal government briefly took interest in the Ortega property. Water resources were considered strategically important, particularly in the arid Southwest, where military training facilities were being established. A 3-person team from the Department of the Interior conducted a preliminary assessment of the property on August 15, 1943. The team consisted of geologist Dr. Marcus Bennett, hydrologist Dr. Patricia Reinhardt, and engineer Thomas Green. Their mission was to evaluate the property's water resources for potential military use. Their initial findings, documented in daily field reports, were promising. 8 wells in excellent condition despite decades of neglect, noted Green in his first report. Water clarity exceptional. Preliminary testing indicates high mineral content potentially beneficial for agricultural applications. Recommend comprehensive analysis. On the second day of their assessment, the team focused on measuring water volume and flow rates. Dr. Reinhardt's report noted, wells maintain identical water levels despite varying surface elevations. This defies standard hydrological principles and suggests a pressurized common source. When water is drawn from one well, levels in all 8 decrease uniformly, then return to baseline within hours. Estimated renewable volume exceeds all projections based on regional water table data. Source remains undetermined. The team's report, later classified and only declassified in 1972, described the property as unsuitable for development despite abundant water resources. The report noted that all 8 wells remained functional, with water levels unchanged from previous surveys decades earlier. The report recommended against any attempt to utilize the water. The justification for this recommendation was redacted in the declassified version. What remains unredacted is an appendix describing the unusual physical properties of the water. Samples exhibit normal chemical composition consistent with regional groundwater. However, laboratory analysis reveals abnormal molecular behavior when samples are subjected to sound waves in the frequency range of human speech. Further analysis recommended. No record of this further analysis exists in declassified documents. Dr. Bennett's personal field journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1961, provides context for the team's abrupt change in assessment. Day 3 at the Ortega site has produced disturbing result, he wrote. Reinhardt observed that water samples removed from the property gradually returned to normal molecular behavior, suggesting the anomalous properties are linked to the location itself rather than the water. Green discovered historical records in the ranch house indicating that Santiago Ortega performed regular rituals at each well, which he interpreted as primitive attempt to appease the water. Most significantly, we all experienced auditory phenomena when near the central well after sunset, what sounded like distant conversations in multiple languages coming from beneath the water's surface. We have agreed to recommend against development without detailing our experiences, which would likely be dismissed as hallucination induced by desert conditions. The property returned to state control after the war and remained largely forgotten until 1968. That summer, a severe drought affected much of Arizona. Water rationing was implemented in several communities. As part of drought mitigation efforts, state officials reviewed records of all potential water sources on state lands. The Ortega property was identified as having significant untapped water resources, according to a memo from the State Water Authority. The memo, authored by Deputy Director Harold Mitchell, noted that historical records indicated the wells had never failed, even during previous droughts. While concerns about water quality have been raised historically, modern treatment methods can address most contaminants, Mitchell wrote. The consistent volume reported across multiple surveys suggests a substantial underground reservoir that could serve communities throughout Yavapai County during the current crisis. On July 17th, a water management team arrived at the property to assess the wells for potential emergency use. The team consisted of hydrologist Dr. Eleanor Rivera, engineer Thomas Whitaker, and 2 assistants whose names were not recorded in the official report. Dr. Rivera's field notes describe their initial findings. All 8 wells remain in remarkable condition. Brick linings show minimal deterioration. Water levels remain consistent at approximately 12 feet below ground level in all wells. Initial water quality tests indicate potability. The team established a base camp near the old ranch house, which by this time had partially collapsed from decades of neglect. They planned a 3-day assessment focusing on water volume measurement and extended quality testing. On the second day, July 18th, Dr. Rivera recorded an unexpected observation. Water levels in all 8 wells dropped simultaneously at approximately 1530 hours. Levels decreased by exactly 4 feet in all wells, then returned to normal at 1845 hours. No explanation for synchronized behavior, no correlation with regional seismic activity or barometric pressure changes. Rivera's notes for that evening indicate growing concern about unexplained phenomena. Assistant Wilson reports hearing what sounded like voices from the easternmost well while collecting samples at dusk. Assistant Diaz confirms similar experience at the western well approximately 1 hour later. Both describe voices as muffled but distinct and speaking in multiple languages, including English and Spanish. Whitaker suggests possible acoustic effect caused by wind through brick shafts. Team agrees to maintain scientific skepticism while documenting all observations. The final entry in Dr. Rivera's field notes, dated July 19th, reads simply, "Testing discontinued, recommendation. Property to remain restricted, wells to be sealed permanently." The brevity of this entry contrasts sharply with her detailed notes from previous days, The official report submitted to the State Water Authority echoes this recommendation without providing justification. Dr. Rivera requested reassignment to a different region immediately upon return from the field. Her request was granted. What happened during that final day at the Ortega property? The official record is silent. However, a personal journal belonging to Thomas Whitaker was discovered among his effects after his death in 1985. The journal, now in the possession of his family, contains an entry dated July 19, 1968, that offers a disturbing account. Whitaker wrote, E.R. insisted on collecting water samples from the central well at dawn. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. She descended using the rope ladder we'd secured. The well is wider than modern construction, approximately 6 feet in diameter. Water level was at 12 feet as measured previously. E.R. had descended to approximately 10 feet when she suddenly became very still. She appeared to be listening intently. She then stated, calmly, professionally, that she could hear voices coming from below the water's surface, multiple voices speaking in Spanish. Before we could respond, she continued her descent until she was standing in water up to her knees. She collected her samples methodically, still listening. When we extracted her, she was visibly shaken but insisted on analyzing the samples immediately. She worked without break until mid-afternoon, when she suddenly ordered all equipment packed and declared the assessment complete. She has refused to discuss what her analysis revealed. Whitaker's journal continues, during breakdown of camp, the 2 assistants were assigned to secure the central well. They reported hearing what sounded like their names being called from below the water's surface. E.R. immediately reassigned them to equipment transport and sealed the well herself. Before departure, she instructed me to verify that all 8 wells were secured with the original covers we had removed upon arrival. I complied, though I admit I worked with unusual haste. While securing the easternmost well, I distinctly heard what sounded like water movement below, though the surface was completely still when I directed my flashlight downward. We departed before sunset and returned directly to Phoenix rather than staying in Prescott as planned. E.R. submitted her report recommending permanent sealing of the wells immediately upon our return. She then took a leave of absence. The assistants resigned the following week. I have requested transfer to the Northern District. A later entry in Whitaker's journal, dated August 10th, suggests continued effects from the experience. E.R. called today. First contact since our return from Ortega. She sounded distressed. She reported hearing running water in her house at night, though plumbers found no leaks. She asked if I had experienced anything similar. I admitted that I had. Specifically, the sound of water dripping in completely dry rooms, all was just beyond my field of vision. We agreed to meet tomorrow to discuss our experiences. She did not appear at the arranged time. When I called her home, her husband reported she had left suddenly the previous evening without explanation. Her whereabouts remain unknown. Following the 1968 assessment, the state government allocated funds for permanently sealing the wells on the Ortega property. Work was scheduled for October 1968, but the contractor hired for the job withdrew without explanation after visiting the site. A second contractor also withdrew. The project was ultimately completed by a team from the Army Corps of Engineers in January 1969 as part of a classified operation. Each well was filled with concrete to ground level. A monument-style marker was placed at each location, marked only with numbers 1 through 8. The operation was supervised by Colonel James Harrison, whose after-action report provides clinical details of the process. Each well was inspected with remote cameras prior to sealing. No obstructions or anomalous objects were detected. Water levels remained consistent at 12 feet below grade in all 8 wells. Samples were collected from each well for analysis by USGS facilities. Sealing was accomplished using standard techniques, with each well receiving approximately 12 cubic yards of specially formulated concrete designed to prevent water intrusion. Operation completed in 72 hours without incident. Site secured and personnel debriefed according to protocol. What Colonel Harrison's official report doesn't mention is documented in his personal correspondence with a former colleague, General William Matthews. In a letter dated February 3, 1969, Harrison wrote, "The Arizona operation was like nothing I've encountered in 27 years of service. My men performed admirably despite increasingly difficult conditions. The water resisted our efforts in ways I cannot explain. Concrete poured into the wells would harden only to specific depth, then disappear entirely overnight. We finally succeeded by mixing salt and iron filings with the concrete, a technique suggested by an elderly local man who approached our perimeter one evening. He refused to identify himself but claimed his grandfather had worked for the Spaniard who found what was hidden in the water. My team completed the mission, but 3 men have since requested psychiatric evaluation. All report the same symptom. They hear running water at night, even in the desert, even in completely dry environments. I have experienced this myself. I write to you because I believe the military should maintain awareness of this location indefinitely. Something was sealed in those wells besides water. The property was redesignated as a State Water Resource Research Restriction Zone and fenced with military-grade materials. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter for approximately 6 months following the sealing operation. After this period, security was reduced to motion sensor equipment and occasional patrols. The property remained under this heightened security until 1987, when budget cuts forced a reduction in monitoring. Today, the fences remain, though in disrepair. The warning signs have been replaced periodically, with the most recent replacement occurring in 1991. Local residents still avoid the area. Hikers occasionally report seeing the fenced compound from a distance, but express an unexplained reluctance to approach. Satellite imagery shows the property as largely unchanged since the late 19th century, a remarkable island of undevelopment in an increasingly populated region. What was discovered at the Ortega Ranch? Why did the wells inspire such fear in those who studied them? The official record offers few clear answers. In 1972, an Arizona Republic reporter named Michael Chen attempted to investigate the property's history for a feature on Arizona's Unsolved Mysteries. His research notes, preserved in the newspaper's archives, indicate that he interviewed Dr. Rivera, who by then had relocated to New Mexico. Chen's notes from the interview are fragmentary but revealing. Dr. Rivera initially refused to discuss Ortega property, he wrote. Changed mind after I mentioned government sealing operation. Became agitated. Said sealing was necessary but likely temporary. When asked to elaborate, stated, "Water finds its own level. Water remembers. Water waits." Asked specifically about what she experienced in the well in 1968. She refused to answer directly, but said, "When I stood in that water, I was in 2 places simultaneously. I could feel the floor of the well beneath my feet, but I could also feel myself seated at a table. I could see the sky above through the well opening, but I could also see a ceiling, walls, 4 other people seated with me. They were expecting me. They had been waiting since 1893. According to Chen's notes, Rivera refused to discuss specific findings, but made one cryptic statement. The water in those wells isn't just connected to underground streams or aquifers. It's connected to something else entirely. When pressed for clarification, Rivera reportedly ended the interview. Chen's planned feature was never published. His editor cited lack of substantiating evidence as the reason for a cancellation. Chen left journalism shortly afterward and avoided the subject of the Ortega property for the remainder of his life. Chen's unpublished notes contain one additional detail of interest. After his interview with Rivera, he attempted to locate the 2 unnamed assistants who had been part of the 1968 assessment team. He identified one, Maria Diaz, who was working as a field technician for the U.S. Geological Survey in California. Chen's notes from his telephone interview with Diaz are brief but disturbing. Subject extremely reluctant to discuss Ortega. stated she has never been the same since assessment, reports persistent auditory hallucination, the sound of water dripping always just behind her. Most notably, claims that since 1968, her reflection in still water is not quite right, like someone else is looking back. A subject terminated interview abruptly when asked about what the team discovered on their final day at the property. The most recent official assessment of the Ortega property occurred in 1984, conducted by the Arizona Department of Water Resources. The assessment was performed remotely, using aerial surveys and historical data. No personnel were dispatched to the site. The resulting report simply confirmed the continued restricted status of the property and noted that concrete seals on all 8 wells appeared intact based on aerial photography. The report recommended continued restricted status without providing justification. Internal departmental correspondence associated with the 1984 assessment reveals institutional reluctance to engage directly with the property. Department Director Robert Williams wrote to the assessment team, "Given historical incidents associated with this location, remote assessment is authorized. Under no circumstances are personnel to enter the property without explicit written authorization from this office. Previous reports and security protocols are to be respected regardless of their apparent rationality. Some departmental historical knowledge is better left unquestioned." This unusual directive from a scientific agency suggests awareness of risks not documented in public records. In 1990, a graduate student in hydrogeology at the University of Arizona named Jason Martinez became interested in the Ortega property while researching historical water usage in the region. Martinez submitted multiple requests to the Department of Water Resources for access to complete records on the property. His requests were repeatedly denied. Undeterred, Martinez filed a Freedom of Information Act request that yielded heavily redacted documents. The documents provided to Martinez revealed little beyond what was already publicly known. However, the pattern of redaction itself proved informative. Entire sections regarding water composition and behavior are completely redacted, Martinez noted in his research journal. References to specific incidents on the property have been removed, with only dates remaining visible. Most curiously, all information about the 1968 assessment and subsequent sealing operation is absent entirely, as if the documents have been purged rather than merely redacted. So Martinez's thesis advisor reportedly discouraged his interest in the property, suggesting more accessible research topics. Martinez persisted, focusing instead on historical records predating state involvement. Through this approach, he discovered something overlooked in previous research, land title records indicating that before the mining company owned the property, it had belonged to a religious order that established a small mission on the site in 1852. The mission was abandoned after only 3 years. Church records cited unsuitable conditions without elaboration. Further investigation by Martinez uncovered a personal letter written by Father Domingo Espinosa, the last priest stationed at the mission, to his superior in Santa Fe. The letter, preserved in church archives in New Mexico, provides a disturbing context for the mission's abandonment. "The native peoples warned us against settling here," Espinosa wrote. "They said the waters were unclean, not in body but in spirit. I dismissed this as pagan superstition. Now I understand their wisdom. The well we dug provides water that nourishes the body but disturbs the soul. Brothers Miguel and Tomas have left the mission without explanation. I hear their voices at night, calling from the well. I dream of water filling the mission, lifting me from my bed, carrying me below ground to another place that looks the same but is not. I have requested permission to abandon this site and burn all structures before departing. May God forgive what we have disturbed." Permission was granted. The mission was indeed burned, its foundations covered by soil and natural growth over the following decades. When Santiago Ortega purchased the property in 1877, no visible evidence of the mission remained. Yet he chose to dig his first well at precisely the location where the mission well had been, a fact he could not have known without guidance. Martinez's research notes include a curious finding. The mission had reported digging only one well, yet Santiago Ortega's property had 8. According to Martinez's analysis of soil surveys and water table maps, the natural conditions would typically support 1, possibly 2 wells in that location. The presence of 8 productive wells defied hydrological expectations for the region. Martinez's thesis proposal suggested that the wells were arranged in a specific pattern corresponding to astronomical alignments significant in both native and Spanish cultures. The wells form an asymmetrical pattern that corresponds precisely to no known constellation, he wrote. However, when historical star charts from the mid-19th century are overlaid, the pattern aligns with a specific arrangement visible only during the spring equinox in 1852, the year the mission was established. This suggests intentional placement based on astronomical knowledge rather than practical water management considerations. In the spring of 1991, despite warnings from his advisor, Martinez visited the area surrounding the Ortega property. He did not attempt to enter the restricted zone, but interviewed elderly residents in nearby communities. One interview subject, a man in his 90s who requested anonymity, claimed his grandfather had been one of the original ranch hands who disappeared along with Santiago Ortega. According to family lore passed down through generations, the ranch hands had not disappeared, but had gone into the wells willingly. "My grandfather was Mateo Vasquez," the elderly man told Martinez. "Family stories say Ortega found something in the water, a doorway of some kind. He promised his workers a share in his discovery if they helped him. My grandmother received one letter from my grandfather after his supposed disappearance. It said only, 'We found another place, same as here, but different. We cannot return, but we are not gone.' My grandmother kept vigil at the ranch for 3 days after receiving the letter, then left the territory entirely. She would never speak of what she saw there." Martinez included this account in his thesis with appropriate academic skepticism. His thesis, titled Hydrological Anomalies of the Central Arizona Highland Transition Zone, was submitted in May 1991. It received minimal attention outside his department and was archived with standard academic protocol. Martinez accepted a position with a water management firm in California after graduation and never returned to Arizona. A curious footnote to Martinez's research emerged 3 years later. In 1994, he published a single article in an obscure journal of hydrological studies. The article documented an unusual phenomenon he had observed in water samples collected from locations surrounding the Ortega property. Under specific lighting conditions, microscopic examination reveals structural anomalies in water molecules collected within a 5-mile radius of the restricted zone, he wrote. These anomalies are not present in samples collected from greater distances. The affected water exhibits periodic molecular reorganization that defies current understanding of fluid dynamics. Most notably, when such samples are subjected to sound frequencies matching human vocal patterns, the anomalies intensify. Martinez published no further research on the subject. Attempts to contact him for this narrative were unsuccessful. The mystery of what happened at the Ortega Ranch in 1893 remains unsolved. What caused Santiago Ortega and his 4 ranch hands to disappear? Why did subsequent occupants of the property experience similar fates? What properties of the well water caused such concern among trained scientists? The official record is fragmentary and often contradictory. Some local historians suggest that the entire matter has a simple explanation. The wells likely connected to an unstable cave system that periodically released toxic gases, causing hallucinations and eventually death to those exposed. This theory, while plausible, fails to explain the consistent water levels across all 8 wells, or why multiple government agencies maintained the property's restricted status for over a century at considerable expense. Others point to the region's complex geological history. The Bradshaw Mountains contain numerous abandoned mines, some dating back to Spanish exploration. Perhaps the wells intersected with forgotten mine shafts, creating dangerous conditions. Again, this theory fails to address the full range of documented phenomena. In 1993, exactly 100 years after Santiago Ortega's disappearance, an environmental assessment team conducting surveys several miles from the restricted property reported unusual water table readings. Their instruments detected what appeared to be water movement flowing away from the Ortega property, despite the wells having been sealed for decades. The team's report noted the anomaly but offered no explanation. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The lead scientist on the environmental assessment team, Dr. Jonathan Wells, later confided to a colleague that his team had experienced unexplained events during their work near the Ortega property. "We never approached closer than 3 miles to the restricted zone," he wrote in a personal email that surfaced during subsequent unrelated litigation. "Nevertheless, each night in camp, we heard what sounded like running water beneath our tents. Equipment placed on the ground recorded subtle vibrations consistent with underground water movement, yet our hydrogeological surveys indicated no active watercourses in the area." Most disturbingly, on our final night, several team members reported identical dreams of sitting at a table in an unfamiliar house, with 4 men speaking Spanish and 1 empty chair, as if waiting for someone to join them. The most recent mention of the Ortega property in official records comes from a 2010 internal memo in the Arizona Department of Water Resources, inadvertently included in documents released for an unrelated public records request. The memo simply states, "Annual satellite monitoring of Site OR 8777 shows no change in surface conditions. Groundwater monitoring stations in 5-mile radius continue to show periodic anomalous readings similar to 1993 findings. Recommendation: continue restricted status indefinitely." A handwritten note on the memo, apparently added by a senior official, reads, "Concrete deterioration estimated at 47%. Prepare contingency plan for resealing operation within 5 years. No personnel entry under any circumstances. Remote methods only." Today, the Ortega Ranch exists as a blank space on maps and in public records. The name has been removed from official documentation, replaced by a numerical designation. The property appears on no tourist maps, no hiking guides, no real estate listings. The residents of nearby communities acknowledge its existence only reluctantly, typically changing the subject when asked directly. Yet the story persists in the region's folklore. Hikers occasionally report hearing what sounds like voices speaking Spanish from empty ravines near the property boundary. Pilots flying small aircraft over the region describe unusual air currents above the property that create navigation challenges. Most curious of all, meteorological data indicates that the property receives measurably less rainfall than surrounding areas, as if the weather itself avoids the location. In 2008, an anonymous post appeared on an internet forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The author claimed to be a former employee of the Arizona Department of Water Resources who had accessed classified files on the Ortega property. According to this unverifiable account, the department maintains a sealed record known as the Rivera Report, the complete findings of Dr. Eleanor Rivera's 1968 assessment. The post claimed that Rivera's analysis revealed that water from the Ortega wells contained microscopic structures that mimicked human cellular patterns when exposed to sound frequencies matching human speech. These structures reportedly reorganized themselves into complex formations that Rivera described as microarchitectural, tiny replicas of buildings, specifically the Ortega ranch house. The post was deleted within hours of appearing, and the account used to post it was never active again. What secrets do the sealed wells of the Ortega Ranch still hold? What connections exist between the waters Santiago Ortega discovered and the inexplicable events that followed. Perhaps some mysteries are best left unexplored, some depths should remain unplumbed, and some waters should never be drawn to the surface. As the old Spanish proverb warns, "No todos los pozos llevan agua, y no toda agua da vida." Not all wells carry water, and not all water gives life. If you find yourself traveling through central Arizona and your route takes you near the Bradshaw Mountains, you might glimpse an unusual fenced compound in the distance, unmarked on any map, unmentioned in any guidebook. You might feel an inexplicable urge to change direction, to take another route. It would be wise to heed that instinct, for the waters of the Ortega Ranch remain sealed beneath concrete and soil, but not forgotten, and perhaps not entirely contained. When Santiago Ortega first discovered those wells in 1877, he believed he had found his fortune. What he actually found was something else entirely, something that waits still beneath the Arizona soil, beneath the concrete seals, beneath the still surface of waters that should not exist, waiting, perhaps, for someone else to hear the voices that call from below and to answer them as so many have before.